The photograph trembled in 80-year-old Ayanna Blackhorse's weathered hands, her granddaughter Sarah watching from across the kitchen table as memories flooded back like a dam breaking. "Child, let me tell you about the summer of 1885 when I learned that love sometimes wears the mask of cruelty." Sarah's eyes widened as she studied the faded image, a massive girl standing beside a stern-faced man in front of a Montana mining camp. The coffee cup slipped from Sarah's fingers, crashing against the hardwood floor as she recognized the brutal reality hidden in her grandmother's gentle smile. "Great-grandfather made you work in the mines?" Ayanna's voice cracked with 40 years of buried pain. 16 hours a day, hauling copper ore until my hands bled and my back screamed. The whole town watched him slowly kill his own daughter." Her granddaughter's face went pale. "But why would anyone—" "Before you judge him, you need to know what he knew, what I didn't discover until it was almost too late." Ayanna's fingers traced the photograph's edges, worn smooth by decades of secret glances. "Some folks still call him a monster, but monsters don't weep over their children's graves every night for 40 years. What terrible secret had driven a father to such desperate measures? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The summer of 1885 blazed across Copper Ridge, Montana territory, like a furnace that forgot to quit. Dust devils danced between the wooden buildings that lined Main Street, while the constant hammering from the copper mines echoed off the surrounding Rocky Mountains. The town of 847 souls had sprung up almost overnight when Dakota Blackhorse struck his first vein 3 years prior, transforming sleepy cattle country into a booming mining community where fortunes were made and lost with each swing of a pickaxe. Ayanna Blackhorse stood at her bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, while her father's voice thundered from the kitchen below. At 19, she carried 240 pounds on her 5'6" frame, a fact that made her the subject of cruel whispers and pointed stares throughout Copper Ridge. Her Cherokee mother had died bringing her youngest child into the world 7 years ago, leaving Ayanna to manage their sprawling log house and tend to her father's increasingly bitter moods. "Ayanna, breakfast won't cook itself." Dakota's voice cracked like a whip through the morning air. She hurried downstairs, her heavy footsteps creaking against the pine boards. Dakota Blackhorse sat hunched over financial papers, his weathered hands gripping a tin cup of coffee. At 45, he looked older, premature gray streaking his black hair, deep lines carved around his dark eyes from years of squinting into mine shafts and darker memories. His success as the town's second-largest mine owner had come at a price that showed in every weary gesture. "The Henderson mine flooded again last night," he muttered without looking up. 3 men trapped for 6 hours before they dug them out. Ayanna set a plate of bacon and eggs before him, noting how his hands shook slightly, whether from exhaustion or the whiskey he thought she didn't know about, she couldn't tell. "They'll be all right, won't they, Papa?" His laugh held no humor. "Nothing's all right in this business, girl. You survive or you don't." Through the kitchen window, she spotted Dr. Enepe Crowfeather making his morning rounds, his black medical bag swinging at his side as he walked with purposeful strides toward the mining district. The Harvard-educated physician had arrived in Copper Ridge 6 months ago, bringing modern medical knowledge to a town that had previously relied on whiskey and prayer for healing. His mixed Sioux and Irish heritage made him an outsider like herself, though his education and profession commanded respect that her size never would. Dakota followed her gaze and frowned. "Stay away from that doctor. Man's got ideas above his station." "He saved Mrs. Patterson's baby last month," Ayanna protested quietly, "and he'll save himself right out of town if he keeps pushing where he's not wanted." Dakota's voice carried an edge that made Ayanna's stomach clench. Some things in this world don't change no matter how much fancy schooling a man has. Remember that. As church bells began ringing across the valley, neither father nor daughter could imagine how violently their world would shatter before those same bells rang again. The annual Founders' Day celebration transformed Copper Ridge's dusty Main Street into a carnival of bunting, brass bands, and the mingled aromas of roasted corn and apple pie. Ayanna had spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting her mother's secret recipe, the same one that had won the baking contest for 5 consecutive years before her death. Now, standing behind the judge's table in her best calico dress, handmade but straining at every seam, she watched Mayor William Thornton sample her creation with the gravity of a man deciding the fate of nations. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor announced, his voice carrying across the crowded square, "this year's pie contest winner is Miss Ayanna Blackhorse." The crowd's applause felt warm as summer rain until she stepped onto the wooden platform to accept her blue ribbon. The boards, built to support the town's typically petite women, groaned ominously under her weight. She heard the whispers, always the whispers, but pressed forward, reaching for the ribbon with trembling fingers. The crack came first, sharp as a gunshot. Then the world tilted sideways as the platform collapsed, sending Ayanna crashing through splintered wood to land hard on her knees in the dirt below. Her prize-winning pie exploded in a shower of crust and filling, coating her dress and face in sticky humiliation. Silence stretched like a held breath before the laughter began, not gentle chuckles, but cruel, pointed mockery that cut deeper than any physical wound. "That's what happens when you put an elephant on a sparrow's perch," called out Jake Morrison, the blacksmith's son, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Should have built it stronger for the circus act," added another voice from the crowd. Ayanna scrambled to her feet, pie filling dripping from her hair, her face burning with shame as 300 pairs of eyes watched her humiliation. Some faces showed pity, others disgust. But worst of all were those that showed nothing, the blank, uncomfortable stares of people who saw her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. She ran. Through the crowd, past the bandstand where the musicians had stopped mid-song, beyond the booths selling penny candy and hair ribbons, until she reached the sanctuary of her father's barn. There, surrounded by the familiar scents of hay and leather, she collapsed onto a pile of feed sacks and let the tears come. That's where Dakota found her an hour later, still covered in pie remains, clutching the blue ribbon she'd somehow managed to save from the wreckage. "They're talking," he said without preamble, settling heavily onto a wooden crate beside her. "The town council, the ladies' auxiliary, even some of the miners." Ayanna wiped her nose on her sleeve. "About the platform?" "About you." His voice held a flatness that made her stomach drop. "They're saying you're becoming a problem. That decent folks shouldn't have to worry about their children seeing—" He gestured helplessly at her body. "Seeing what, Papa? Seeing me?" Dakota's jaw worked silently for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decisions already made. "Your mother made me promise something before she died. Made me swear on her grave that I'd keep you safe no matter what it cost." A chill ran down Ayanna's spine despite the summer heat. "What does that mean?" "It means fat girls don't survive in this world, Ayanna." The words came out harsh, desperate. "I won't bury another woman I love because she couldn't fit into the shape this world demands." He stood abruptly, pacing the barn's confines like a caged animal. "Starting tomorrow, things change. No more hiding in this barn feeling sorry for yourself. No more accepting scraps of pity from people who see you as entertainment." "Papa, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to save your life, even if you hate me for it." His dark eyes held a wild desperation she'd never seen before. 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, we start your training." "Training for what?" "To become someone this world can't ignore. someone it can't push around or laugh at or treat like a freak show. He gripped her shoulders with calloused hands. You're going to learn to be strong, Ayanna. Stronger than any of them. That night, Ayanna lay in her narrow bed listening to her father's footsteps pace the floor below, punctuated by the soft clink of whiskey bottle against glass. Through her window she could see the lights of Copper Ridge twinkling in the darkness, each one representing a person who had watched her fall and laughed. She pressed her face into her pillow and tried to imagine what her mother would have said. But all she could hear was the echo of splintering wood and cruel laughter, and her father's promise delivered like a threat. I'm going to save your life, even if you hate me for it. At 4 o'clock the next morning, the real nightmare would begin. The rooster hadn't even considered crowing when Dakota's heavy boots thundered up the stairs, rattling Ayanna from the first peaceful sleep she'd managed in days. Pale starlight filtered through her bedroom window, casting everything in shades of gray that matched the dread pooling in her stomach. Up, now! His voice held the same iron authority he used with his miners, brooking no argument or delay. Ayanna stumbled from her bed, her nightgown tangling around her legs as she reached for her work dress. The floorboards felt cold against her bare feet, and she could hear her father moving around downstairs with military precision, the scrape of chairs, the clank of metal, sounds that promised nothing good. When she descended to the kitchen, she found it transformed into something resembling a drill sergeant's quarters. Her father had arranged an assortment of items on the table: work gloves, a leather water pouch, a coiled rope, and most ominously, a wooden yoke designed for oxen. From now on, every day starts at 4, Dakota announced without looking at her. You'll haul water from the creek to fill both our barrels and the Hendersons next door. That's 40 trips up the hill. Then you'll chop wood until breakfast. Papa, I already do the washing and cooking, and you do woman's work. His dark eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. That's not enough anymore. Time you learned what real labor feels like. He lifted the wooden yoke, its weight clearly substantial even in his strong hands. This belonged to my grandfather. Carried him through the Cherokee removal when he was barely older than you. If it was strong enough to save his life, it's strong enough to save yours. The yoke settled across Ayanna's shoulders like a burden made manifest, its rough wood digging into her collarbones. The attached chains dangled empty, but she could already imagine their weight when loaded with water buckets. Papa, please. The whole town will see me like this. Good. His voice held no warmth, no trace of the man who used to sing Cherokee lullabies while braiding her hair. Let them see that Dakota Blackhorse's daughter isn't afraid of honest work. Let them see you earn your place in this world instead of expecting it handed to you. The first trip to the creek broke something inside her that she hadn't known could break. The yoke bit into her shoulders, the water buckets sloshed and slopped with every unsteady step, and by the time she'd climbed the steep path back to their house, her lungs burned like she'd swallowed fire. 23 more trips stretched ahead like a prison sentence. By the 5th trip, her legs shook. By the 10th, blisters bloomed on her palms despite the gloves. By the 15th, she could taste blood where she'd bitten her tongue to keep from crying out. But it was the faces that hurt most. Mrs. Henderson peering through her kitchen curtains with a mixture of horror and fascination, the Miller children stopping their morning chores to point and giggle, old Tom Waverly shaking his head in what might have been sympathy or disgust, impossible to tell which. That's enough gawking, came a voice from behind her as she struggled up the hill with buckets number 37 and 38. Dr. Enape Crow Feather appeared at her side, his medical bag slung across his shoulder and concern written plainly across his angular features. Without asking permission, he took one of her buckets, immediately easing the strain on her already screaming shoulders. "Don't!" Ayanna gasped, though relief flooded through her like cool water. "Papa will be angry if he sees you helping. Your father's not here. Enape's voice carried a gentle firmness that reminded her of her mother treating wounded animals. And you're about to collapse. When did you last eat? Or sleep properly? The kindness in his tone nearly undid her completely. For 3 weeks now, she'd endured Dakota's increasingly harsh regimen, hauling water before dawn, chopping wood until her hands bled, scrubbing floors with lye soap that left her skin raw and cracked. The single daily meal he allowed her consisted of thin broth and hard bread, barely enough to sustain a child, much less a grown woman performing manual labor. "I'm fine," she lied, the words automatic after years of hiding pain. "You're not fine. You're dehydrated, malnourished, and showing signs of severe physical stress." He set down the bucket and gently turned her chin toward him, examining her face with professional detachment. "Your lips are cracked, your skin is gray, and you're swaying on your feet. Papa says this is what love looks like, making me strong enough to survive." Something dangerous flashed in Enape's dark eyes. "This isn't love, Ayanna. This is something else entirely." Before she could respond, Dakota's voice cracked across the morning air like a whip. "Get away from my daughter." He came striding down the hill, his face twisted with a fury that made Ayanna's blood freeze. Behind him, she could see faces appearing in windows, neighbors drawn by the commotion like moths to flame. "Mr. Blackhorse," Enape began, his voice carefully controlled. "Your daughter needs medical attention. She's showing signs of becoming strong." Dakota positioned himself between them, his hand resting meaningfully on the knife at his belt. "Something you wouldn't understand, sitting in your fancy office all day. I understand medicine. And what you're doing to her isn't training. It's torture." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot, impossible to take back. Ayanna saw her father's face go pale, then flush dark with rage. 30 days, Dakota said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "Ayanna has 30 days to prove she's worth keeping in this family. If she can't meet my standards by then, she'll be sent somewhere that can handle difficult cases." The threat settled over them like a shroud, and Ayanna realized with crystalline clarity that her father wasn't trying to save her life at all. He was preparing to end it. The 30-day ultimatum hung over Copper Ridge like a storm cloud that refused to break. Word of Dakota's challenge spread through the mining town faster than wildfire through dry grass, dividing the community into harsh, unforgiving camps. Some praised his tough love approach, nodding sagely over their morning coffee as they discussed the necessity of preparing children for a cruel world. Others whispered behind closed doors about the thin line between discipline and cruelty, their voices dropping to hushed tones whenever Ayanna passed by. Dr. Enape Crow. Feather found himself caught in the middle of this bitter divide, his medical oath warring with the social pressures of a tight-knit frontier community. Each morning he watched from his clinic window as Ayanna struggled up the hill with her water buckets, her movements growing more labored with each passing day. The professional in him cataloged the signs of severe physical distress, the tremor in her hands, the gray pallor of her skin, the way she favored her left side where the yoke had worn her shoulder raw. But it was the look in her eyes that haunted him most. The desperate hope that flickered there, dimming a little more each day as she pushed her body beyond its limits in pursuit of her father's impossible standards. She had to lose 60 pounds in 30 days, a goal so medically dangerous that Enape couldn't sleep for thinking about the permanent damage it would cause. On the 7th day of her ordeal, he could stand it no longer. "This has to stop," he said, intercepting Dakota outside the general store where half the town could hear their conversation. "You're killing her." Dakota's weathered face hardened like granite. "I'm saving her. Something you clearly don't understand with your soft city ways." I understand medicine. And I understand that what you're calling love looks remarkably like murder from where I'm standing. Enape's voice carried across the wooden boardwalk, causing shoppers to pause and listen with the eager attention of spectators at a prize fight. You calling me a murderer, doctor? Dakota's hand dropped to the knife at his belt, a gesture that sent women hurrying their children inside nearby shops. I'm calling you a father who's lost his way. Enape held his ground despite being outweighed by 50 pounds of muscle and fury. Your daughter is brilliant, kind, and stronger than any woman I've ever met, but you're so focused on changing her body that you're destroying her spirit. Her spirit won't keep her alive when the wolves come calling. Dakota's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You think this world has room for weak things? You think kindness pays the bills or puts food on the table? I think love isn't supposed to leave bruises. The words hit Dakota like a physical blow, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face before the mask of stern authority slammed back into place. Stay away from my family, doctor. That's not a request. But Enape couldn't stay away. Not when his conscience wouldn't let him sleep and his medical training screamed warnings about the damage being inflicted daily. He began finding excuses to pass by the Black Horse property during Ayana's morning routine, ready to intervene if she collapsed. More than once, he watched her stumble and nearly fall, only to force herself upright through sheer determination. It was on one of these clandestine observations that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Ayana's water bucket slipped from her trembling hands, splashing its contents across the ground. But instead of the clear creek water he expected, the liquid was faintly discolored with an oily sheen that caught the morning sunlight. That evening, Enape made his way to the creek under cover of darkness, carrying a collection of glass vials and his portable testing kit. What he found there confirmed his worst suspicions. Someone had been adding substances to the water supply that fed the Black Horse property. Chemicals that would accelerate weight loss, but at a devastating cost to overall health. Mercury, arsenic, strychnine in doses carefully calculated to cause gradual poisoning while mimicking the effects of extreme dieting. Whoever was doing this possessed both medical knowledge and access to expensive compounds, narrowing the list of suspects considerably. The revelation struck him like lightning. Ayana wasn't just being pushed beyond her physical limits by her father's misguided love. Someone was actively trying to kill her, using Dakota's training regimen as the perfect cover for slow-acting murder. His hands shook as he collected water samples, his mind racing through the implications. How long had this been going on? How much poison had already accumulated in Ayana's system? And most importantly, who in Copper Ridge possessed both the means and motive to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme? The next morning brought answers he didn't want to find. Akacheta Stone Crow, the town council leader and self-appointed guardian of Copper Ridge's moral standards, paid an unexpected visit to Enape's clinic. A man whose mixed Cherokee and white heritage should have made him sympathetic to outsiders, Akacheta instead seemed determined to prove his worthiness to the white community by embracing their most exclusionary attitudes. "Doctor," Akacheta began without preamble, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from Enape's desk. "I hear you've been concerning yourself with the Black Horse situation. If by concerning myself you mean providing medical care to someone who desperately needs it, then yes." Enape kept his voice carefully neutral, while his mind catalogued every detail of Akacheta's appearance. The man's expensive clothes, his soft hands unmarked by manual labor, his calculating eyes that missed nothing. "The girl is becoming a problem for our community. Surely you can see that." Akacheta leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man explaining simple facts to a child. "We're trying to attract railroad investment. bring civilization to this territory. Investors don't want to see unfortunate examples of frontier life parading around in public. Unfortunate examples? Enapei's pen snapped between his fingers. We're talking about a human being, not a business liability. Are we? Akacheta's smile never reached his eyes. Because from where I sit, we're talking about a drain on community resources. Someone who takes up space and food that could better serve productive members of society. Her father understands this, even if his methods are crude. The casual cruelty in Akacheta's words made Enapei's stomach turn, but it was the flash of something else in the man's expression that sent ice through his veins. Knowledge, satisfaction. The look of someone watching a carefully laid plan unfold exactly as intended. "You've been to the creek," Enapei said quietly. Akacheta's smile widened. "I've been many places, Doctor. It's amazing what a concerned citizen can accomplish when he puts his mind to it." "You're poisoning her." "I'm solving a problem." Akacheta stood slowly, his bulk casting a shadow across Enapei's desk. "The weak must be culled, so the strong can thrive. It's nature's way, and frankly it's kinder than letting her continue to embarrass herself and her family." The admission hung between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Enapei forced himself to remain seated, to keep his expression neutral, even as rage burned through his chest like acid. "Dakota doesn't know," he said. "Dakota doesn't need to know. He's doing his part perfectly well without my help." Akacheta moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "The girl will be dead within the week, Doctor. Her system can't handle much more abuse. And when she finally collapses, everyone will assume it was her father's training that killed her. A tragic accident. A father's love gone too far. And you get what you want. I get a clean town, prosperous, attractive to the right kind of investors." Akacheta's voice hardened. "And you get to choose which side of history you want to be on. The winning side, where doctors who know how to keep their mouths shut find their practices thriving. Or the losing side, where unfortunate accidents happen to people who ask too many questions." After Akacheta left, Enapei sat in his empty clinic for a long time, staring at the water samples on his desk and wrestling with an impossible choice. He could expose the poisoning, but without concrete proof of Akacheta's involvement. It would be his word against a respected community leader's. Worse, revealing the truth might prompt Akacheta to escalate his timeline, finishing Ayana before justice could intervene. Or he could stay silent and watch an innocent woman die, while her father unknowingly helped her kill her. That night, he made his decision. If Akacheta wanted to play games with poison, then Enapei would beat him at his own game. But first he needed to save Ayana's life without alerting her would-be murderer to his interference. The antidote required careful calculation and even more careful administration. Too much, too fast, and Ayana's already stressed system might shut down completely. Too little, too late, and the accumulated toxins would claim her before healing could begin. But as he prepared the first dose, a terrible thought occurred to him. What if Dakota was involved? What if the grieving father's harsh love was actually calculated cruelty, designed to mask his daughter's murder beneath a veneer of misguided discipline? The possibility made his hands shake as he filled the syringe, because if Dakota was part of the conspiracy, then Ayana had no one left in the world she could trust. No one except a half-breed doctor who was already falling in love with her courage, her intelligence, and her refusal to surrender, even when the whole world seemed determined to destroy her. The next morning would bring the first test of his plan, and with it the beginning of a deadly game where one wrong move could cost Ayanna her life. The confrontation erupted on Main Street like a powder keg touched by flame, drawing every soul in Copper Ridge from their morning routines to witness what would become the town's most talked-about spectacle since the great mine collapse of '82. Ayanna stood in the center of it all, her body swaying dangerously as the accumulated poison and malnutrition finally began overwhelming even her iron determination. "You're killing her!" Ennepe's voice cracked across the dusty street like a whip, his usual professional composure shattered by 3 weeks of watching systematic destruction disguised as fatherly love. Dakota wheeled around from where he'd been adjusting Ayanna's yoke, his weathered face twisting with a rage that made nearby children shrink behind their mother's skirts. "What did you say to me?" "I said, you're killing your own daughter." Ennepe stepped closer, his medical bag clutched in white-knuckled fists. "Look at her, man. Really look at her. When's the last time you saw her smile? When's the last time she didn't flinch when you entered a room?" The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Mrs. Henderson stood on her front porch wringing her hands, while Jake Morrison and his fellow miners formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their loyalty clearly with Dakota, despite the growing unease in their eyes. Ayanna tried to speak, to diffuse the tension crackling between the two men like lightning before a storm, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please, don't fight over me." "Fight over you?" Dakota's laugh held no humor, only bitter exhaustion. "Girl, I'm fighting for you. Every damn day I'm fighting for your survival in a world that wants to chew you up and spit out the bones." "By starving her?" Ennepe's medical training warred with his growing emotional investment, creating a dangerous combination of professional outrage and personal fury. "By working her until she collapses. By turning her into a public spectacle for the entertainment of people who should be protecting her." The words hit Dakota like physical blows, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his granite features. Around them, the crowd stirred uneasily as neighbors began recognizing uncomfortable truths in the doctor's accusations. "You think I enjoy this?" Dakota's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried farther than his earlier shouts. "You think I like watching my baby girl suffer? You think any father wants to be the one causing his child's tears? Then stop." "I can't stop." The admission tore from Dakota's throat like a confession extracted under torture. "Don't you understand? I can't protect her from what's coming if she stays weak." "The world is full of wolves, Doctor, and they smell blood in the water." Ennepe took another step closer, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into every line of Dakota's face, the way his hands shook with more than anger. "What wolves? What are you so afraid of?" But before Dakota could answer, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Gentlemen, surely we can resolve this discussion more privately." Akacheta Stone Crow emerged from the crowd with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His expensive suit and polished boots marked him as someone whose hands had never been dirtied by honest labor, yet his presence commanded immediate attention from the assembled townspeople. "This is a family matter," Akacheta continued, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of a mediator while his cold eyes calculated advantages and weaknesses. "Perhaps we should allow Mr. Blackhorse to handle his daughter's discipline without public interference." Ennepe felt his blood chill at the subtle emphasis on discipline, hearing in it the echo of their previous conversation. This was theater, he realized with growing horror. Akacheta was positioning himself as the voice of reason while ensuring that his carefully orchestrated murder would continue without interruption. "Some family matters become community concerns," Ennepe said carefully, "when they involve potential harm to community members." "Potential harm?" Akacheta's eyebrows rose in practiced surprise. I see a father preparing his daughter for the realities of frontier life. Surely a Harvard-educated physician can appreciate the necessity of physical conditioning in such harsh circumstances. The trap was beautifully laid. If Enepe pressed his case, he would appear to be an outsider interfering with local customs. If he backed down, Ayana would continue receiving daily doses of poison disguised as creek water, while her father unknowingly provided the perfect cover story for her eventual death. But Enepe had spent the long night preparing for this moment, and he had cards of his own to play. "You're absolutely right," he said, reaching into his medical bag with deliberate slowness. "Physical conditioning is essential, which is why I brought these water samples for everyone to see." He produced 3 glass vials, each containing liquid that caught the morning sunlight with an oily, unnatural sheen. The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity overcoming their social discomfort. "I collected these from the creek that supplies the Black Horse property," Enepe announced, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent street. "Notice the discoloration, the unusual odor. These are signs of chemical contamination." Dakota's face went pale. "Contamination?" "Mercury, arsenic, strychnine." Enepe spoke each word like a death sentence, watching as understanding dawned across the faces of the crowd. "Someone has been adding industrial chemicals to your water supply, Mr. Black Horse. Your daughter isn't failing to lose weight because she lacks willpower. She's being systematically poisoned." The revelation hit the assembled townspeople like a physical blow. Women gasped and reached for their children, while the miners began looking at each other with growing suspicion and anger. In their world, where clean water meant the difference between life and death, poisoning someone's well was considered one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. "That's impossible," Akacheta said quickly, but Enepe caught the flash of panic in his eyes before the man's practiced composure reasserted itself. "Who would do such a thing? And why?" "That's an excellent question," Enepe replied, never taking his gaze from Akacheta's face. "I've been wondering the same thing. Who in Copper Ridge has access to expensive industrial chemicals? Who has both the knowledge and resources to carry out such a sophisticated plan?" The crowd began murmuring among themselves, their voices rising as suspicion and outrage fed on each other. Several people were looking at Akacheta with new interest, noting his expensive clothes and calculating eyes. But Dakota wasn't listening to the crowd's speculation. He was staring at his daughter with an expression of such anguish that several women in the crowd began weeping openly. "Ayana," he whispered, reaching toward her with trembling hands. "Baby girl, I'm so sorry. I believed." She swayed on her feet, the accumulated stress and poison finally overwhelming her system. "Papa? I thought I was saving you." Dakota's voice broke completely. "But I was killing you. God help me, I was helping them kill you." As father and daughter reached for each other, Akacheta realized his carefully laid plan was unraveling. With Enepe's evidence and Dakota's growing understanding, it would only be a matter of time before the full conspiracy was exposed. "This is all very touching," Akacheta said, his voice hardening as his mask finally slipped. "But I'm afraid it's also irrelevant." The crowd turned to stare at him in confusion, not yet understanding what Enepe had already realized. Cornered animals were always most dangerous. "You see," Akacheta continued, producing a small derringer from his coat pocket, "the girl was always going to die. The only question was whether it would look like an accident or not." As the crowd erupted in screams and scattered for cover, Enepe threw himself between Akacheta and Ayana, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether love could triumph over the kind of evil that wore a respectable face and spoke in reasonable tones. The gun fired with a sound like thunder, echoing off the mountains that surrounded their small town and changing everything forever. The gunshot echoed off the surrounding mountains like thunder, but it was the silence that followed that truly terrified the scattered crowd. Enape lay motionless in the dust of Main Street, a dark stain spreading beneath his still form, while Ayana knelt beside him, with blood on her hands and anguish carved into every line of her face. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing her trembling fingers against the wound in his shoulder where Akacheta's bullet had found its mark. "Please don't leave me, not now, not when I finally understand what love is supposed to feel like." But even as she spoke, another gunshot cracked through the morning air. This one came from behind her, and when she turned, she saw her father standing over Akacheta's fallen form, smoke still rising from the barrel of his old Navy Colt. "Papa?" Her voice came out small and broken, that of a child seeking comfort in a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Dakota's weathered face had aged a decade in the span of minutes. His hands shook as he holstered the gun, and when he looked at his daughter, she saw the weight of terrible understanding in his dark eyes. "I killed my own wife," he said quietly, the words carrying clearly in the unnatural stillness that had settled over Copper Ridge. "Not with my hands, but with my blindness, with my stupidity." The crowd began creeping back from their hiding places behind buildings and water troughs, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern for their neighbors. Mrs. Henderson appeared with clean bandages, while Jake Morrison and two other miners carefully lifted Enape's unconscious form to carry him to the clinic. "7 years ago," Dakota continued, his voice gaining strength as the truth finally forced its way out, "my Sarah started getting sick, losing weight she couldn't afford to lose, complaining of stomach pains and headaches. I thought it was the pregnancy, thought it was normal." Ayana pressed a blood-stained cloth against Enape's wound, listening to her father's confession while monitoring the steady rise and fall of the doctor's chest. He was alive, but the bullet had done significant damage. An infection in this remote location could prove just as deadly as the initial injury. "But it wasn't normal, was it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the devastation in her father's expression. "Akacheta had been poisoning our well for months. The same chemicals, the same method. He wanted our mine, wanted the richest copper vein in the territory, and he knew I'd never sell." Dakota's voice cracked with 7 years of suppressed grief. "So he targeted the thing I loved most, made her sick slowly, so slowly I never suspected, and when she died in childbirth, you blamed yourself. I should have seen it. Should have protected her." He knelt beside his daughter, his calloused hands gentle as they helped apply pressure to Enape's wound. "And when you started putting on weight after your mother died, when people began talking about you the way they had about her?" The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Ayana's weight gain hadn't been natural. It had been the result of the same slow poisoning that had killed her mother, combined with the grief and depression of a child who had lost everything. And Dakota, consumed by guilt and fear, had interpreted her symptoms as weakness that needed to be beaten out of her rather than illness that needed to be treated. "You thought you were making me strong enough to survive," she whispered. "I thought if I could make you fit their idea of acceptable, they'd leave you alone." Tears carved clean tracks through the dust on his weathered cheeks. "But all I did was help them finish what they started. All I did was become another weapon pointed at my own child's heart." Around them, the people of Copper Ridge stood in stunned silence as they grappled with the revelation that their respected town council leader had been systematically murdering families for financial gain. The myth of their peaceful, prosperous community lay shattered at their feet like broken glass, reflecting uncomfortable truths about the price of willful blindness. Dr. Enepe stirred in Ayana's arms, his dark eyes fluttering open to focus on her tear-streaked face. "Are you hurt?" he managed to whisper. "I'm fine," she lied, because how could she explain that her heart was simultaneously breaking and healing, that she was mourning the father she'd thought she'd lost while celebrating the one she'd finally found? "Akacheta? Dead?" Dakota answered simply. "And good riddance to him." As the crowd began to disperse, carrying news of the morning's revelations to every corner of the territory, Ayana helped lift Enepe's injured form and began the careful journey to his clinic. But with each step, she felt the poison that had been accumulating in her system for years finally beginning to loosen its grip. The hardest truth of all was still ahead: learning to live with love instead of fear, forgiveness instead of guilt, and hope instead of the desperate resignation that had defined her entire life. But for the first time since her mother's death, Ayana Blackhorse believed that kind of healing might actually be possible. 3 weeks after the shooting, as autumn painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the full scope of Akacheta Stone Crow's conspiracy began unraveling like a poisoned tapestry. What the people of Copper Ridge discovered made them question everything they thought they knew about their community, their neighbors, and themselves. The investigation, led by Territorial Marshal James Whitfield and assisted by Dr. Enepe Crowfeather's meticulous documentation, revealed a web of corruption that stretched back nearly a decade. Akacheta hadn't simply targeted the Blackhorse family. He had systematically eliminated anyone who stood between him and complete control of Copper Ridge's mineral wealth. 14 families, Marshal Whitfield announced to the packed town hall, his weathered face grim as granite. 14 families poisoned over the years. Some died outright, like Sarah Blackhorse. Others were slowly weakened until they sold their claims for pennies on the dollar and fled the territory, never knowing they'd been deliberately made sick. The crowd stirred uneasily as neighbors looked at each other with new suspicion and dawning horror. How many unexplained illnesses had they attributed to bad luck or weak constitutions? How many friends had they buried without questioning why so many healthy people suddenly fell ill? Ayana sat in the front row beside her father, her hand clasped tightly in Enepe's uninjured one. The doctor's left arm remained in a sling, but his recovery had been mercifully swift thanks to his own medical knowledge and Ayana's dedicated nursing care. Their relationship had deepened during those long hours in the clinic where she'd proven herself as capable with surgical instruments as she was with household management. But it was the revelation about her mother that had shattered Ayana's understanding of her own life story. "We found Akacheta's journals," the marshal continued, producing a leather-bound ledger that seemed to emanate malevolence even from across the crowded room. Detailed records of which chemicals he used, when he administered them, and how much each family's suffering was worth to his grand plan. Dakota's jaw clenched as the marshal read from the damning document. Sarah Blackhorse. Dosage increased during pregnancy to ensure complications. Expected payout from mine acquisition, $15,000. Ayana Blackhorse. Secondary target. Long-term elimination recommended to prevent inheritance complications. The words hit Ayana like physical blows. She had spent 7 years believing her mother died from natural complications. 7 years watching her father drink himself into bitter isolation. 7 years thinking her own body was somehow inherently wrong and shameful. All of it had been orchestrated by a man who calculated human suffering in terms of mineral rights and property deeds. "There's more," Marshal Whitfield said grimly. "We found correspondence with mining consortiums in Denver and San Francisco. Akacheta wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger network that targeted small mining communities throughout the territory, using similar methods to consolidate mineral rights into the hands of large corporations. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. This wasn't just about one evil man's greed, it was about a systematic effort to steal the American dream from ordinary families who had risked everything to build new lives in the frontier. Dr. Enepe struggled to his feet, his face pale but determined. "I've been in correspondence with physicians in other territories. Similar patterns of unexplained illnesses, sudden deaths, and mysterious mine claim transfers have been reported in at least 6 other communities. We're dealing with what amounts to industrial-scale murder." The weight of this knowledge settled over Copper Ridge like a shroud. They weren't just mourning their own losses, they were confronting the reality that their small community had been a testing ground for a form of evil that threatened the very foundation of frontier democracy. But it was Ayanna who stood up next, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, and spoke the words that would echo through the territory for years to come. "They tried to make us hate ourselves," she said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the packed hall. "They tried to make us believe that our bodies, our families, our very existence was somehow shameful or wrong. They wanted us to disappear quietly, to sell our dreams for nothing, and slink away like beaten dogs." The crowd listened with rapt attention as this young woman, who had been their object of pity and ridicule, transformed before their eyes into something magnificent and powerful. "But we're still here," Ayanna continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My mother's love is still here, in every kindness I show and every hand I extend to help others. My father's strength is still here, in his willingness to admit his mistakes and fight for what's right. Dr. Crowfeather's courage is still here, in his refusal to let injustice hide behind medical respectability." She turned to face the assembled townspeople, her gaze taking in faces that had once mocked her and now regarded her with something approaching awe. "They couldn't kill what matters most about us, our ability to love each other, to protect each other, to stand together against those who would reduce us to nothing more than obstacles to their greed. And if we remember that, if we hold on to that, then they've already lost." The applause that erupted was unlike anything Copper Ridge had ever heard. Not the polite clapping of a social gathering, but the thunderous approval of a community discovering its own strength and purpose. Marshal Whitfield had to call for orders several times before he could continue with the legal proceedings. The territorial government was launching a full investigation into the mining consortium's activities, with potential criminal charges extending far beyond Montana territory. There would be justice, he promised, though it might take years to fully untangle the web of corruption. But for Ayanna, the most important revelation was still to come. That evening, as she sat with her father and Enepe on their front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Dakota reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. "These were your mother's," he said quietly, unwrapping a collection of letters tied with ribbon. "She wrote them to you for when you were older. I wasn't strong enough to read them before. But now." With trembling fingers, Ayanna opened the first letter, dated just weeks before her mother's death. The familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes, but it was the words themselves that finally healed the last broken places in her heart. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I am gone, but my love remains. Remember that you are perfect exactly as you are. Your worth is not measured by the world's narrow standards, but by the love you carry and the kindness you show. You are my greatest joy, my finest creation, my legacy of hope in a world that sometimes forgets how to be gentle. Never let anyone convince you that you are less than magnificent." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ayana finally understood that she had never been broken at all. She had simply been a flower, trying to bloom in poisoned soil. And now, with the poison finally purged and the truth finally revealed, she was free to become everything her mother had always known she could be. 40 years later, on a crisp autumn morning in 1925, 80-year-old Ayana Blackhorse Crow Feather sat in her rocking chair on the wraparound porch of the house she and Enepe had built together, watching her granddaughter Sarah struggle with demons that echoed across the generations like ripples in a still pond. "Grandma Ayana," 22-year-old Sarah said, her voice tight with the same self-loathing that had once consumed her grandmother. "The other girls at the university, they're all so tiny and perfect. They look at me like I'm some kind of circus freak." Ayana's weathered hands stilled on the photograph she'd been holding, the same faded image that had started this story hours earlier. In it, a massive girl stood beside a stern-faced man, both of them trapped in a moment of pain that had taken decades to fully understand and heal. "Child," Ayana said gently, "let me finish telling you about that summer of 1885, because the most important part isn't about the poison or the conspiracy or even the shooting. It's about what came after." Sarah settled back into her chair, wrapping her grandmother's quilt around her shoulders as the old woman's voice carried them both back to a time when the world was younger and harder, but somehow more honest about its cruelties. After the truth came out, after Akacheta was buried and the territorial marshal finished his investigation, our little town faced a choice. We could scatter to the winds, carrying our shame and trauma like stones in our pockets, or we could decide to build something better from the ashes of what we'd lost. The transformation of Copper Ridge hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of painful community meetings, of neighbors confessing their complicity in silence, of families confronting the fact that their prosperity had been built on others' suffering. Some folks couldn't handle the weight of that knowledge and did indeed pack up and leave, seeking fresh starts in places where their consciences couldn't follow. But most stayed, and those who remained set about creating something unprecedented in the Montana Territory, a community explicitly built on the principle that every person's worth was inherent and non-negotiable. Your grandfather Enepe became the Territorial Health Commissioner, Ayana continued, her voice warm with pride and enduring love. He spent the rest of his career tracking down similar conspiracies throughout the West, saving countless families from the kind of systematic destruction we'd experienced. But more than that, he pioneered new approaches to medicine that treated the whole person, not just their symptoms. Sarah leaned forward, captivated despite her modern sophistication. "What do you mean?" He understood that healing required more than just treating physical ailments. He started programs that we'd now call mental health services, support groups for families dealing with trauma, educational initiatives that taught people to recognize the signs of deliberate poisoning or abuse. Ayana's eyes took on a distant quality as she remembered those revolutionary early days. People traveled hundreds of miles to learn from him, to bring his methods back to their own communities. As for Ayana herself, the revelation of the truth had unleashed abilities and ambitions she'd never known she possessed. Free from the constant drain of poison and the psychological weight of believing herself fundamentally flawed, she had blossomed into a force of nature that reshaped not just Copper Ridge, but the entire territory's approach to education and women's rights. "I became the first female medical assistant in Montana Territory," she said with quiet pride. "Your grandfather taught me everything he knew about anatomy, pharmacology, surgical procedures. I could suture wounds, set bones, deliver babies, and compound medicines as well as any trained physician. But more importantly, I specialized in helping other women who had been told they were somehow defective or unworthy." The school Ayana established had started as a simple one-room building where she taught the children of Copper Ridge to read and write. But it had quickly evolved into something much more ambitious, an institution that welcomed students regardless of their physical appearance, family background, or social status. Children who had been labeled as difficult or hopeless by other schools found acceptance and encouragement in Ayana's classroom. "We called it the Forever Flowering School," she explained to Sarah, "because we believed that every child carried within them the seed of something beautiful, and our job was simply to provide the right conditions for that beauty to emerge." Word of the school's success had spread throughout the territory, attracting families from as far away as California and Texas who brought their own difficult children. Kids who were too fat, too thin, too dark, too light, too quiet, too loud, too anything that didn't fit society's narrow definitions of acceptable. Some of our students went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, Ayana said, her voice filled with maternal pride. Others became farmers, shopkeepers, craftspeople, honest work that fed their families and served their communities. But what they all had in common was the knowledge that their worth as human beings was never in question. The ripple effects had extended far beyond education. As the first generation of Forever Flowering graduates came of age, they carried with them a fundamentally different understanding of human value and potential. They started businesses that hired based on character rather than appearance, served in local governments that prioritized the welfare of all citizens rather than just the wealthy and well-connected, and raised their own children with the radical notion that love should be expressed through acceptance rather than control. "Your grandfather Dakota lived to be 85, Ayana continued, her voice growing soft with memory. He spent his final decades as the most beloved man in 3 counties, known for his fierce protection of anyone who was being bullied or mistreated. Children would run to him when they were hurt, knowing they'd find gentle hands and kind words rather than lectures about toughening up. The mining fortune that Akacheta had killed for had been transformed into something far more valuable than gold or copper. Under Dakota's reformed leadership, the Black Horse Mining Company had become the territory's first worker-owned cooperative, sharing profits equally among all employees and establishing safety standards that other companies were eventually forced to adopt. "But the most important thing," Ayana said, leaning forward to take her granddaughter's hands in her own, "was that we learned the difference between love that controls and love that liberates. Your grandfather, Dakota, thought he was protecting me by trying to force me into an acceptable shape. But true protection means creating a world where people don't have to change themselves to be safe. It means changing the world so that everyone can be safe being exactly who they are." The marriage between Ayana and Enepe had become the stuff of legend throughout the territory, not because it was perfect, but because it demonstrated what was possible when 2 people chose to see each other's true worth rather than society's distorted reflections. They had raised 4 children together, each one different in temperament and ability, but each one treasured for their unique contributions to the family and community. "Your father," Ayana said, referring to Sarah's late parent, "inherited your grandfather Enepai's gift for healing, but he chose to focus on healing minds rather than bodies. He became one of the territory's first psychologists, helping people recover from trauma and abuse. And your mother's work with the suffrage movement helped ensure that the next generation of women would have legal rights to match their moral worth." As the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed so much pain and healing over the decades, Ayana reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth, the same leather ring that Enepe had placed on her finger 60 years earlier. "This isn't worth much in dollars and cents," she said, placing it in Sarah's palm. "But it represents something priceless, the promise that love doesn't ask you to become smaller or quieter or more acceptable. Real love says, 'I see you exactly as you are, and you are magnificent.'" Sarah turned the simple ring over in her fingers, feeling the weight of history and hope it carried. "But Grandma, what if they're right? What if I really am too big, too much, too—" "Child," Ayana interrupted gently, "I want you to understand something that took me years to learn. The people who try to make you feel small are not doing it because there's something wrong with you. They're doing it because there's something missing in them, some emptiness that they're trying to fill by diminishing others." She gestured toward the thriving town spread out below them, where electric lights were beginning to twinkle on in windows, and the sounds of families gathering for dinner drifted on the evening breeze. "Every building you see down there, every family, every success story, it all grew from the decision to reject the lie that some people matter more than others. We chose to build a community where worth is measured by kindness rather than conformity, by contribution rather than appearance." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and self-doubt that had been her constant companion since childhood. What happened to all those people? The ones who were part of the conspiracy? "Justice," Ayana said simply. "The territorial government prosecuted everyone they could find, and the mining consortium was forced to pay reparations to every family they'd harmed. But more importantly, we made sure their methods could never be used again. We taught people to recognize the signs, to ask questions, to protect each other." She stood slowly, her aged joints protesting, but her spirit still strong, and placed a gentle hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Sarah, honey, you are the fourth generation of women in our family to face the world's attempts to make you feel unworthy. But you're also the fourth generation to have the strength, the knowledge, and the love necessary to prove them wrong. Your great-great-grandmother's blood runs in your veins, and she was a woman who changed the world simply by refusing to accept that she was anything less than magnificent." As they walked together into the warm, welcoming house that love had built, Sarah finally understood that she carried within her not just the legacy of past struggles, but the promise of future triumphs yet to be won. Dear friends, as we reach the end of Ayana's remarkable journey, I want you to close your eyes and remember that moment when someone made you feel too much, too loud, too quiet, too big, too small, too emotional, too distant. Maybe it was a parent who thought harsh love would toughen you up, a teacher who labeled you difficult, or a society that demanded you shrink yourself to fit impossible standards. Now imagine discovering, like Ayana did, that the very people who claimed to know what was best for you were actually poisoning your well of self-worth. But here's the beautiful truth that took her 80 years to fully understand. Real love doesn't ask you to become smaller. It creates space for you to bloom exactly as you are. Your worth was never conditional on meeting someone else's expectations. You were magnificent then, you are magnificent now, and you have the power to heal not just your own wounds, but to create the kind of world where your grandchildren never have to question their inherent value. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is permission to stop trying to earn love we already deserve. What moment in your life do you wish you could tell your younger self you were perfect exactly as you were? Have you ever discovered that someone's tough love was actually harmful rather than helpful?